I think there's a lot of assumptions about queer life in Nazi Germany. A lot of what people know or think they know is about gay men, lesbians, queer women, and trans people are oftentimes sort of forgotten or relegated to the sidelines.
Today on Rainbow Country, lesbians in Nazi Germany.
Hi, I'm Christopher Rice, and this is Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Samuel Klaus Kunicki. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am well. First of all, did I butcher your name?
Uh, it's Clues Hunicki. So you were close.
Klaus Kunicki. May I call you Samuel or Sam? How should
Sam is great.
Okay. Sam, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time, especially to talk about your current book. I will not abandon you. I will not abandon you, queer women in Nazi Germany. Talk to me about this book and essentially what you're telling within the pages of I Will Not Abandon You, Queer Women in Nazi Germany.
So, first and foremost, it is, as the name suggests, a history of queer women in the Nazi period in Germany. This is, a topic that people don't necessarily know a lot about. I think there's a lot of assumptions about queer life in Nazi Germany. A lot of what people know or think they know is about gay men, lesbians, queer women, and trans people are oftentimes sort of forgotten or relegated to the sidelines. So at the end of the day, this is an attempt to tell a kind of comprehensive history of queer women in the 12 years of Nazi rule. It starts off in the Weimar period, which is the republic that Germany sets up after World War I and is known today as a kind of mecca for queer subcultures and queer rights. And so it starts there with this kind of flourishing of lesbian identity, lesbian culture, and then quickly moves into the Nazi seizure of power in 1933. There's a kind of immediate backlash against this queer efflorescence of the 1920s after Hitler takes power, and it walks the reader through that. One of the really interesting things about lesbian life in the Nazi period is that there's never a specific law that criminalizes female homosexuality or sort of queer female behavior. And so one of the things that the book is trying to do is show how, in spite of that, queer women are in fact persecuted. So despite the fact that there isn't a concrete law or policy that says if you're a lesbian, you're going to jail, nonetheless, queer women still face persecution. In spite of that, though, the book really tries to grapple with the agency of queer women. That is to say, despite that persecution, queer women were able to make consequential decisions about their own lives, about other people's lives, and they used that agency in a whole variety of ways. Some of them used it to resist fascism. Some of them were complicit in fascism. Some of them used it to throw grand balls of queer people in Berlin that lasted up through World War II. And then ultimately, the book takes us into the post-Nazi era and charts some of the life trajectories of these women and also looks at efforts by women who were persecuted or their next of kin in cases where they died to get restitution from the post-war German government.
Is it fair to say that this is a history book?
Yes, it's certainly a history book.
And you are based where?
I live in Washington, D.C. I'm a professor at George Mason University in Northern Virginia.
And for yourself, why was it important for you to tell this particular story, write this particular book now?
Well, so I'm a gay man, I'm queer, and a lot of the research I do is on queer people. I was trained as a German historian, and so that's sort of my bread and butter. That's what I research, that's what I write about. My first book was about queer people in post-war Germany, looking in East and West Germany and kind of gay and lesbian activist groups in those countries. When I started researching that book, I stumbled across a set of 4 files in a Berlin archive. And this is sort of, what historians dream about doing. We love to find these unexpected treasure troves of information. And I found these 4 files Each one of them was a police file that recorded a case in which a lesbian couple or an alleged lesbian couple had been denounced to the police. And in some cases, they'd been denounced by their own parents or neighbors or colleagues. And that really kind of triggered my interest because at this point, the dominant view was that queer women had not been persecuted. And so this really kind of sparked a question for me. What is the police doing investigating these women if there's not a law that they've broken, and if other historians who I've read tell me that queer women weren't persecuted? So this was about 10 years ago. I started working on this. I wrote an article. I thought it would be a one-off project, but it just sort of stuck in my mind as a really interesting project. Again, a lot of queer history focuses on gay men. It tends to not focus as much on lesbians. Historically, trans people too have been relegated to the sidelines, although thankfully that's also starting to be rectified. And so I just sort of kept clawing at this subject. I kept going back to various archives looking for more stories. And eventually I had accumulated enough stories that I thought, oh, this actually could be a book. Pair that then with the Trump era, and it seemed sort of obvious to me that there not only was I interested in queer life under fascism, but I thought many other people might be interested in
They're
sort
living
of,
it.
right, exactly. And so to me, this was a model of not only thinking about what does persecution look like under these sorts of governments, but also how do people actually survive these sorts of fascist dictatorships, and how do people, in some cases seek to thrive?
I asked you where you were,
Hmm.
where you are. You're in America.
Yes.
I'm in Canada. I'm in Toronto. And it doesn't I was interested to know why you wanted to write this book now, because it strikes me funny that you're writing about, you know, uh Nazis, persecuting homosexuals
Hmm.
back in the day. But right now, you've got in America a lot of kind of like, Nazi-ish type of,
Hmm.
movement acting like the government against a lot of people, gay people,
Yeah.
lesbian people, trans people in America. Does do those parallels does it almost what's the word I want to use? Does it almost justify you writing this book now?
I
The
mean,
fact that what you're writing about is history, but it's also reality for a
yeah.
lot of your American citizens.
Um, I don't know that I would go so far as to say it justifies it. I think, I'm a historian. I think history for its own sake is also worthwhile, but I think it adds an sort of urgency to this history. And it's history that's really important to know right now for those reasons that you just stated. Uh, if you look at the US today, most historians agree that we have a sort of fascist or quasi-fascist movement that's in power. Uh, Depending on who you ask, right, there is a kind of violent crackdown going on against people who live in the United States. People like me have so far been lucky. We're not targeted, although higher education, universities are among those who have been targeted by this administration. Um, but immigrants, people of color, trans people in particular, have been targeted by this administration. So I think it is incredibly important to know what these forms of persecution have looked like in the past and how people have successfully or less successfully tried to resist those forms of persecution as models for what to do in the present day.
Exterminate the homosexuals, twirling through fascism, the queer years of Weimar. These are just some of the chapter titles in your book, I Will Not Abandon You, Queer Women in Nazi Germany. When you were researching this book and you came across the information that you came across posters and
Mhm.
propaganda, there are images in the book. Did anything surprise you when you were researching this book? Did anything jump out to you that made you even go, uh-huh, interesting?
I mean, I think almost every story made me sit up and surprised me in different ways. So I've already mentioned just finding these files initially surprised me. Uh, there is one case that I have written about a lot, both in this book and in other articles, of two women named Margot and Marta. Margot's birth name was Holtzmann. She was Jewish. And in order to escape deportation to a camp in Eastern Europe, she winds up marrying a Chinese man. And then later, he winds up denouncing her and her lover, Marta, to the police. And in order to get off, they sort of fabricate the notion that her Chinese husband is running an illegal mahjong gambling ring. There's another case of a woman named Waltraud Hock, who is, in many ways, the reason I wrote this book. I mean, her story kind of threads itself throughout the book. She was a young woman who wound up being murdered in Auschwitz. And one of the things about her case that is just a little tiny note in this police file, she was the illegitimate daughter of a German woman and a American soldier from World War I who was in the German language colored. I don't know specifically what his race was. I don't know specifically what that means, but that suggests she was seen as a person of color in the Nazi government's view. There's another case of a queer woman who winds up marrying a trans woman. And ultimately, both of them are sent to prison as queer people. So, just case after case. There's another case of a queer woman who comes to police attention because she goes on a date with an older man, winds up robbing him of hundreds of marks, goes on a sort of spree on the town, goes to various sort of brothels and underground queer clubs, winds up in a city hundreds of miles to the south, eventually comes home about a week later, and her father sort of takes her by the ear to the police station to confess everything she's done. So each and every one of these stories just, I think, says something quite remarkable. Both about the individuals themselves, but also about these larger questions of queer life under fascism, about how the Nazi state and society worked, which I think is of kind of enduring interest to people, um, and how people, in many ways, tried to resist fascism.
The title, I Will Not Abandon You, Queer Women in Nazi Germany. Is there a story behind choosing this particular title?
Yeah, I always struggle with titles. This is something anyone who knows me, I'm constantly asking friends and colleagues and families, family members to sort of bounce title ideas off of them. In this case, one of the stories that was one of these first files I stumbled across and has really stayed with me. It's a case of two French workers, essentially sort of slave laborers who are brought to the Reich during World War II, two women, and they are in a relationship during this period while they're working in this factory. And eventually they're found out, and their superior sort of reports them to the police and asks the police to make an example of them and says that they're kind of causing disturbances in this factory. They're impeding the war effort. And one of them, the younger, her name's Lucienne, and she goes into her police interrogation and is completely firm. She says, yes, we love each other. We are partners, despite efforts by the sort of administration of this factory to separate us. She says to the police, we have not abandoned each other because we love each other. And that phrase really stuck with me. And originally, the title of the book, when I started writing, was We Will Not Abandon Each Other, just a direct quote from that. As I sort of massaged it and worked with it, I came up with the idea of kind of altering it slightly to I will not abandon you as a way of kind of drawing the reader in, but also really highlighting this element of kind of queer solidarity and queer resistance that is at the heart of this book. Despite it being in part about persecution, really the heart of this book is about queer people making decisions about their own lives, and in many cases trying to resist Nazism in solidarity with one another.
Sam, you are an award-winning historian, an author of numerous books and
Mhm.
articles, an associate professor. History. Talk to
Yes.
me about what is it about history that talks to you? Why history?
Um, well, I think, I don't know. I've been interested in history since I was a child. The very first work of history that I can remember reading was a biography of Henry VIII, who is obviously infamous for his six wives and his sort of various appetites, and in some cases, his real cruelty. And from the moment that I read this biography, I was hooked. I just started devouring history books. I decided then that I wanted to be a historian when I grew up. And I think the first thing about it that just stays with me is history is fundamentally about stories. I also read lots of fiction, and in my own writing and what I look for when I'm reading history are storytellers and stories. And I love reconstructing the past in order to kind of tell those stories in all of their richness. The other thing that I think history is ultimately useful for is that it's very hard for us living in the modern world to have a sense both of where we are and where we might be going as a society, as individuals, as citizens in a state, without having an understanding of history. If we don't understand where we've been, what we've done as a species, basically, I think it's actually very difficult for us to grapple with what the future might look like. Now, that's not to say that historians can predict the future. In fact, we're notoriously bad at predicting the future, and that's why most of us don't try to do it. But I think it does mean it gives us a sense of the realm of possibilities of what could be coming down the pike. And so, again, to give you one example, when we look at the Trump administration, historians were really at the forefront, starting all the way back in 2015, of saying, this looks a lot like fascism. And based on that diagnosis, we can start telling you the kinds of things that this movement and this man might do once they get into power. And in fact, many of those predictions have been borne out in disturbing and dramatic ways.
Okay, so there's a word that I came across a few years ago,
Hmm.
and I like to bring this word up when I interview historians, whether it's an author or a filmmaker making a documentary, and the word is presentism.
Mm.
Presentism, and in my you know basic bitch understanding is, in the most basic of terms, presentism is looking back at history and representing it and using the words, the terms
Hmm.
of that time without putting a modern day lens on it. Case in point might be transgender. That's a
Hmm.
more modern term. Back in the day, it would be transsexual, although transsexual is still used in some parts of the world.
Hmm.
For yourself, when you are writing about history, how conscious are you to represent it the way that it is, the good, the bad, the ugly, as opposed to, wanting to put any kind of a spin on it? How conscious is it for you to represent it the way that it is?
That,
when telling history?
right. That's such a good question. I mean, this is something that historians are constantly grappling with. I'm constantly conscious of this. And I think that I have two kind of impulses here. One is the impulse to take the past on its own terms, to think about the past as a foreign country that I'm almost being teleported into and I'm reporting on what I see. And so, for instance, when it comes to identity categories, I generally tend to use identity categories that people at the time are using. And to the greatest extent possible, I'm trying to use identity categories that my characters themselves used to describe themselves. There are, however, a couple sort of exceptions to that. And that comes from the opposite impulse, which is that I think of history, again, the impact that history has on our world and the importance of historical stories that we tell ourselves to shape the world means, in my mind, that the past is present. The past is still living with us. And it's important to treat it in that way. It's important to treat it as almost a character of its own, or as though these characters sort of might burst off the page and start speaking to us. And so I also try to translate the past into familiar terms and to sort of think with the past in ways that are comprehensible today. And so I think a really good example of this is gender identity. The term that was in use in the Weimar Republic and in the Nazi period was transvestite. Now, that today is a slur. It's not a nice word. It didn't have those connotations back then. And lots of people who we would today consider trans describe themselves as quite happily as transvestites back then. So that term appears in the book. I tried to always put it in quotation marks when it appears as a way of signaling this, again, is a historically accurate term. At the same time, when there are cases of individuals who very clearly were designated one sex at birth and then lived their life as the other sex, uh, you know, this is an era where gender affirming surgery is in its infancy. And you do have these people who, you have trans women who adopt female names, who adopt female dress, who sometimes seek to perform sort of other female functions, and the same with trans men. And I'm very happy to refer to these people as trans men and trans women because I think it's a term that makes sense to us today and accurately describes the lives of these individuals. And so it is this sort of balancing act between wanting to describe the past on its own terms and not make sort of foreign value judgments or identity judgments, while at the same time making the past alive and comprehensible to readers today.
I mentioned earlier that the book has pictures.
Yes.
Posters, propaganda, advertisements. How did you come across those?
All sorts of things. So, there's various collections, for instance, of Nazi propaganda. I found Nazi propaganda posters through these essentially archival collections of posters. Uh, One of the advertisements for a lesbian society in the Weimar Republic, I came across while reading one of the queer periodicals that was published in this period. I have images of some of the women who I'm talking about in the book. Those typically come from these police files. So when they were arrested, oftentimes they would be photographed, and they're traditional kind of mugshots. You get them straight on, you get them in profile. That sort of makes me uncomfortable, right? To say I'm going to depict this individual the way that the police saw them. At the same time, if this is the only image we have of them, I do think it's important where we can to not only resurrect the stories of these individuals, but also to put a face to the name so that readers can better kind of visualize who it is we're talking about. But really, these pictures come from all over. Probably my favorite picture in the whole book, which again comes from a police file, is of a ticket stub for one of these grand lesbian balls that were taking place in the mid 1930s to the early 1940s. So again, despite the persecution, despite the fact that they were living under fascism, you still have these parties of hundreds of queer people taking place in central Berlin. And we have some of the ticket stubs. And so I reprinted one of those in the book.
Sam, here's my last question for you, and it's simply this: what do you hope audiences come away with once they've experienced "I Will Not Abandon You," queer women in Nazi Germany?
Wow. So a few things. I guess first of all, I hope they come away entertained. I hope that they read this and they get wrapped up in the stories and transported. I hope they also come away with a deeper understanding of what persecution is and a better ability to recognize persecution in our own societies today. I think persecution is not always something that declares itself. It's not always the result of law, as in the case with queer women in Nazi Germany. It sometimes emerges from practices, from prejudices, and I hope that this book better enables people to diagnose it in the world today. I also hope, though, that it gives readers a deeper sense of solidarity and the human capacity for solidarity that cuts across lines of identity. Despite the fact that this book is about queer women, one of the main themes is this kind of solidarity that cut across lines of identity, whether the identity was racial, gender, class, or sexual. And, in an era where we oftentimes still think really concretely in terms of identity categories and identity politics has sort of become a dirty word, my hope is that this book offers a vision of what a social solidarity or a politics can look like that takes identity seriously, that doesn't ignore identity, but isn't bound by identity. And so ultimately, I do hope that this book is inspiring to people today as they confront fascist movements in the US or elsewhere in the world.
Samuel Kluz-Hunicki. Did I get it right?
You did.
Hey, hey, hey. Thank you for your time. Well said, well done, well written.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.